Boa tarde a todos que nos estão a acompanhar esta Lisbon Speed Talk sobre o Brexit. Nós vamos ter uma conversa de meia hora em inglês sobre o que é que seguirá em relação ao Brexit, mas antes de apresentar o nosso convidado, eu gostava só de dizer que podem as perguntas e comentários que queiram fazer ao longo da sessão podem ser feitas em português e eu depois traduzirei esses comentários e essas perguntas para o nosso convidado. A sessão será em inglês para que todos nos possamos compreender e, nomeadamente, para que o Daniel Wincott possa participar. I'll switch to English now, and I'll welcome Daniel Wincott to our Lisbon Speed Talk on Brexit. It's been in June 2016, on a very miserable and rainy day in the UK, the British voters decided to leave the European Union. 3 years, 3 prime ministers in 3 elections later, Britain actually left the EU at the end of January 2020, starting a period of transition during which the negotiations of the future relationship between the European Union and UK, it's ongoing. And that negotiation, which is not easy to start off with, it's ongoing under the conditions of a worldwide pandemic. To discuss what follows and what could happen and what now for the relationship between the UK and the European Union and for the UK within Brexit, we have with us Professor Daniel Wincott. Daniel is the Blackwell Professor of Law and Society at Cardiff University, and he is also the Director of Governance After Brexit and the Director of Research at the UK in Changing Europe, both of those on the Economic and Social Research Council of the United Kingdom. And I thank Daniel for his willingness and his time, and I'll give you the floor for your initial remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Diolch yn fawr, as would be said in Welsh. I'm speaking to you from just outside Cardiff in the capital of Wales, which is one of 3 parts of the UK which has devolved governments. And I'll come on to that again in a bit more detail later on in my remarks. But Brexit is basically transforming the UK state, both in its external relationships and in its internal organization. As Bernardo said, we're in the process of a transition period during which the UK's future relationship with the European Union is being negotiated, alongside actually other negotiations of relationships with states in other parts of the world, particularly a set of trade relationship discussions with the US. These negotiations, as the American baseball star Yogi Berra said, feel like deja vu all over again. We've been through successive elections, successive prime ministers, as Bernardo mentioned, but the negotiations seem to have this same quality each time of a kind of an expectation on the UK side that some sort of an offer would be made that would meet the needs of the UK in its relationships with the European Union moving ahead into the future. The relationship seems slow and challenging in many ways. Internally, though, Brexit also transforms the nature of the UK state, which is not necessarily widely understood to be a devolved state and a complex territorial state with a different pattern of relationships between the central UK state in London, Westminster, Whitehall, and so on, and devolved governments in Scotland, in Northern Ireland, and in Wales. This state tends to be imagined as, from its center, as a kind of Anglo-British state, And there's a saying about devolution that the UK state tends to devolve and then forget. In other words, it doesn't like to be encumbered by the ongoing kind of troubles and travails of the devolved places, and it only really seems to remember them when some urgent question presses itself forward. Now, those arrangements have been both brought into the sunshine, brought into the center of political debate, and also placed under enormous strain by Brexit. So the path being followed by the UK government is not one that is endorsed by any of the three devolved capitals. And the COVID pandemic is making that external negotiation more difficult, as Bernardo suggested, but it's also making the internal organization of the UK state very much more challenging, very much more strained. Each of the devolved governments is taking a slightly different path to the path being taken for England by the UK state at the center. So the nature of the lockdown has been slightly different in each of the parts of the UK, and the process of lifting that lockdown has also been different. And devolved leaders, including the devolved leadership of the Welsh government, which is led by the other major Britain-wide party, the Labour Party, to the UK government, which is Conservative-led. Now, the devolved government in Wales has traditionally been much more concerned to maintaining good relationships with the UK centre. The government in Scotland is led by Nicola Sturgeon of the Scottish National Party, whose ultimate aim is independence. The government in Northern Ireland is a coalition or a joined government of the DUP, which is a strongly British party, and Sinn Féin, which ultimately wants Irish unification. So in each of those places, there's a significant part of the political leadership that wants to change the nature of the UK state. But in Wales, the government is very keen on devolution, but wants to try and hold the state together. So they're good unionists as well as being pro-devolution. And yet, both in relation to the UK's negotiations with the EU and in relation to arrangements around trying to manage the pandemic, even the Welsh Labour government has been put into a position where it has described the UK government's position on lifting lockdown, for example, or specifically around the question of whether people coming to the UK would need to be quarantined for a period as shambolic. The First Minister in Wales used that word of the UK government. Now, whatever you think about those arrangements, you know, I think it's much too soon to take a decision about who has managed the pandemic effectively, although, you know, the UK as a whole doesn't seem to be in a particularly good position. To have governments in different parts of Britain apparently at such loggerheads is a really striking indication that fundamental constitutional change is coming internally to the UK. And one of the ways in which that's particularly sharp is a set of proposals that we expect to be published in the next few days by the UK government to try and create the foundations for what they're calling the UK's internal market. When the UK left the EU, and particularly after the end of the transition period, the kind of scaffolding of the EU's single market that in effect kind of held the UK together and allowed a measure of divergence in each of the devolved places, but within a shared framework, will vanish. And the question is, does something need to replace it? And if so, what? Now, the UK government has been trailing the idea of a green paper, which is a consultative paper on an internal market, since last summer. In the last period of time, the last month or so, they seem to have stopped any kind of negotiation or discussion with the devolved governments, and they're apparently intending to publish a paper, which may be a consultative paper or it may be a pre-legislative paper, a so-called white paper, despite the fact that there is an absolutely explicit statement from Mike Russell, who's the relevant minister in Scotland, that that proposal is basically unacceptable to the Scottish government. And there are indications that it is also not acceptable to the Welsh government and perhaps also to the Northern Ireland executive. So we're going to see basic change coming. It may well be that the UK government is able, using the traditional doctrine of parliamentary sovereignty, to legislate for the whole of Britain at least, or perhaps even for the whole of the UK, this new internal market structure. If that happens, then according to both Welsh government leaders and Scottish government leaders, that will fundamentally change and weaken the nature of devolution. So we may see a re-centralization of the UK state as a consequence, which probably wasn't an intended consequence of the Brexit process. Alternatively, and perhaps more likely in Scotland and perhaps also in Northern Ireland, an attempt to re-centralize the state may trigger further moves towards independence for Scotland and towards unification of Ireland. So Northern Ireland returning, becoming reunified with the rest of that island. Either way, I think it's certain that there will be fundamental constitutional change. And on that point, I think I'll finish. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Daniel. It's fascinating. I'd like, before opening the floor or picking up the questions, I'd like to ask you two questions. One related to the negotiation between the UK and the EU, and another one related to the internal relationships in the UK. The first one is, how does Britain see itself after the transition period, after finally fully leaving the European Union? What role does it see itself to play within Europe and within the world? One of the expressions that you use regularly by the Prime Minister Johnson is Britain in the world, or the world stage. What does that mean? What is the role that Britain sees itself playing in the future after leaving the European Union?
There is this idea of a global Britain. I think this is an idea that some advocates of Brexit, particularly on the right, so conservative advocates of Brexit, embrace and espouse. So I think they're trying to move away from the idea that Brexit is about keeping people out and cutting Britain off from the world, towards the idea that there's a new global role for Britain after Brexit. I think one of the difficulties is in giving any kind of a precise answer to what that might mean in detail. It becomes even more challenging in the context of changes in geopolitics. So, for example, the last but one Prime Minister, David Cameron, and indeed Boris Johnson himself, when he was Mayor of London at around that time, spent a lot of time and effort cultivating relationships with China. There's been an agreement that Huawei, the Chinese-based telecoms company, would play a central role in the development of a 5G network in Britain. But in the last few weeks, security-based concerns, have been articulated increasingly loudly, particularly amongst some leading advocates of Brexit, but also amongst conservatives who are interested in security policy, saying that this is unwise on security grounds. And given that advocates of Brexit also want to be close to the United States, and the United States president is being quite skeptical about the role of China in the future, navigating this new global role, you know, between America and Europe and China and the Far East is quite a complicated role to try and navigate. There may be a sense in which that sort of global role has a sort of a romantic tinge to it. You know, it harks back to the idea of Great Britain, you know, Great Britain as the center of a free trading global system, which I think is attractive, an attractive idea for some of these advocates of Brexit. Although it's hard to see how making trade with the UK's nearest neighbours potentially more difficult is easy to compensate for Britain by growing trade with other parts of the world, even if those parts of the world are places where trade could grow very rapidly. It's currently at such a low base that it's hard to see how it would replace the trade that the UK currently does with the EU. So I think it's a powerful idea, but I'm not sure it's always easy to kind of state exactly what its content is.
Mm-hmm. Still on the same topic, you mentioned that there's expectations from London in negotiating with Brussels that the EU will see a vision of a future on the new relationship. On this side of the pound, this side of the channel, there's also a vision of the relations, but the key element for the European Union is to preserve the single market and the European construction. So it will not give Britain anything that could jeopardize the single market and the European process. Sometimes we get the impression that that particular concern, that key fundamental concern of preserving the single market and preserving the European Union is not fully understood in Britain. Would that be fair to say that there's a different expectations and the different roles that both Brussels and London play in these negotiations?
So I think there may be something in that. I wonder whether throughout the UK's membership of the European Union, there wasn't a bit of a sense on the UK side that that the kind of formal legal structures of the single market were more sort of rigid than the Anglo-British legal tradition would expect, and so I do wonder sometimes whether there's a sense of the two parties talking past one another, that there are simply different conceptions of what free trade means or what a market means. In Canada, in discussing the relationship between Francophone Canada and Anglophone Canada, there was this concept of two solitudes, that each of these communities kind of talked to itself and didn't really speak to one another very effectively. And I do wonder whether there's some kind of a sense of two solitudes, both solitudes across the UK and the EU, but also solitudes within the UK. In other words, that the governments in Scotland, in Wales, in Northern Ireland, and in London are kind of talking past each other. They don't seem quite to have the same understandings or grasp the same concepts. And you know, famously, the UK's constitutional arrangements are flexible, are uncodified, are unwritten, and this core concept of parliamentary sovereignty runs through them all, so that Parliament can make or unmake any law that it wants to make, except a law that binds itself in the future. And if that's your kind of grounding understanding of how the UK state operates, it becomes very difficult to reconcile that with binding commitments, legal, constitutional type binding commitments, whether those are constitutional commitments with the EU or with other parts of the UK. So I think there is something in what you say.
Antonio Castro asks if you think that the UK will manage to have a special relation with the US after Brexit, and also what's the role of the Commonwealth in projecting Britain into the world after Brexit.
As I hinted a few moments ago, I mean, I think the broader geopolitical situation is so unsettled at the moment that it's very difficult to make predictions about what kind of a relationship the UK will have either with the US or with the Commonwealth looking ahead. I think there is a powerful idea connected to the appetite for Brexit of the Anglosphere, the English-speaking world, which encompasses both the US and much of the Commonwealth. And I think that, as an imagined future, is very attractive to many of the elite advocates of Brexit. It comes through in popular discourse in things like the advocacy of a so-called Australian-style point system for immigration, emphasizing its Australian character, I think, is seen as appealing to people who support Brexit because it's part of this Anglosphere, this English vision of the world, or Anglo-British vision of the world.
Thank you. There's another question from Paulo Crisógono, who remarks that the negotiations between the UK and the European Union have been delayed by not only its complexity, but also by the conditions that the pandemic has imposed on those negotiations. And he wonders if at the end of in December, with all these difficulties, Boris Johnson will get a hard Brexit that he actually wants at the end of the negotiations.
So, I mean, I think there's still time for a UK-EU agreement, but I think to make an agreement in this time frame and these circumstances, it would have to be a very thin deal. So I think even a deal will be what Theresa May would have regarded as quite a hard Brexit. I think there is a real possibility of ending the transition period without an agreement, a so-called no deal. And my sense is that, you know, that could end up being quite challenging. I'm no economist, but the evidence I've seen from economists seems to suggest that the economic impact of Brexit and a hard Brexit or a Brexit without an agreement and the economic impact of the COVID pandemic are both severe, but they're different. The other part of your question was about what Boris Johnson wants. You know, I'm no psychologist or psychotherapist, so I don't really feel I'm in a position to say what Boris Johnson wants. I would say that famously Boris Johnson wrote himself 2 letters before he decided to campaign for Brexit or against Brexit, and chose to campaign for Brexit, having weighed up these 2 decisions. Immediately after the referendum result, he published a newspaper column where he said, "This doesn't mean we're leaving Europe." So he seemed at that point to be teeing himself up to advocate for a very close relationship with Europe, even though the UK was leaving, and that was what he wanted. So his preferences seem to be pretty mobile and to change as the politics of Brexit unfolds. And both Brexit and COVID have really revealed quite a lot about the character of the UK as a state, as a social system, and as an economic system that I don't think was well understood by political leaders or even by the Whitehall machine when Brexit happened. And it came as a surprise, certainly to many people in the UK. So trying to imagine what Boris Johnson wants is quite hard. I would say one other thing, though. Boris Johnson's sort of political lieutenant is Michael Gove. The second in command officially is Dominic Raab, the first secretary and Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs. But Michael Gove has this kind of freelance role as the Duchy of Lancaster, and he's working in Number 10. Last weekend, he gave a speech, the Ditchley Park speech, which is an annual speech to the civil service. He's a leading Conservative politician. He opened the speech by quoting Antonio Gramsci, the Italian Marxist, saying that that we were in a situation where the old is dying, but the new is struggling to be born. He described the UK as in a situation of displaying extensive morbid symptoms. So this suggests to me, he then went on to quote FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the US president who held office for 4 terms and lifted the US out of the Great Depression through the New Deal, and is widely seen as having saved American capitalism through that interventionist New Deal. What this suggests is we have paradoxical conservative revolutionaries right at the heart of the Conservative government in London. So they seem to be have a real appetite for radical and fundamental change to the UK state, and maybe things like the so-called internal market for the UK that same government is advocating, and on which Michael Gove seems to be leading for the UK government, is part of this appetite for fundamental change. Whether they have a plan for that change is a different question. Whether they've got a destination they want to reach is a different question, but they seem to be pushing forward on a path of really fundamental and radical change, and one that isn't welcomed by the governments in Scotland and Wales, and probably not in Northern Ireland either.
We have a couple more questions related to the international affairs. One to do with if there's a significant change in November in the US, will that change the perspective of the UK regarding Europe and regarding Brexit? And one that you already mentioned to do with China, but to do with Hong Kong and the events in Hong Kong. I'd like also to give you a couple of minutes to explore a bit more the internal relations between the 4 nations of the United Kingdom, by saying that if you look at the results of the referendum and then the results of the elections, Brexit is very much an English affair. The decision in 2016 and now the results of the election in 2019 seems to indicate that the support for Brexit is in small towns and industrial towns in England, not so much in university cities or big capitals in England, and not obviously in Scotland, Northern Ireland, or Wales. Do you think that this process that you have already mentioned, but do you think it will lead to an extreme version of nationalism in the four nations of the United Kingdom? Did you think that this will be the tipping point in Scotland, or will trigger the referendum process in Northern Ireland to reunification, or those outcomes are too extreme to Britain?
Okay, so taking the first question about the US, I mean, I suspect that a change of president in the US would make the UK-US relationship easier to negotiate. I imagine that another president would take a different approach to international affairs. I don't know how that would play in relation to China, but I think it might make a difference to US-EU relationships, and also possibly throw the relationship between Ireland, Northern Ireland, and the UK in a different context in the US. There's a very powerful Irish lobby in the US, which has made some pretty straightforward statements about blocking a UK-US trade deal if arrangements and relationships with Ireland aren't handled with sensitivity. I mean, it's striking in relation to Hong Kong that Dominic Raab, who I mentioned a few moments ago, has come out and made some very powerful statements recently about changing the tolerance of the UK for interference in Hong Kong, and giving a path to citizenship and settlement to at least some Hong Kong citizens. Has also made statements about making it more difficult for very wealthy people who may have acquired their wealth in criminal ways to come and settle in London or the big cities. So, you know, there's some interesting things going on in that kind of space. On to the second question. I mean, it's clear that majorities in Northern Ireland and Scotland voted to remain in the EU. Actually, a narrow majority in Wales voted to leave, and there are different kinds of patterns in Wales. It seems that the post-industrial South Wales valleys, the old coalfields and iron-making, steel-making parts of Wales, produced reasonably large numbers of people who voted to leave. So the picture in Wales, I think, is particularly complicated. But what you say about England is true. And I'm involved in a research group which analyzes survey data, public attitudes data. And we've been able to show, I think, pretty clearly that in England, people who prioritize an English identity were much more likely to vote leave, and people who prioritize a British identity were much more likely to vote remain. Whereas in Scotland, we have some ongoing research that hasn't quite been published yet, I have my fingers crossed, which shows that in Scotland, people who prioritize a British identity in Scotland are more likely to vote leave and people who prioritise a Scottish identity in Scotland were more likely to vote remain. Interestingly, in Wales, it's like Scotland. In other words, it seems that people who had prioritised a Welsh identity were more likely to vote remain, and people who had prioritised a British identity were more likely to vote leave. Now, one of the key things that this means is that British identity is not one thing across the whole of Britain. It means politically, it means different things in Scotland and Wales and England. And of course, although we don't have the same kind of survey data for Northern Ireland, it seems pretty clear that people who emphasise a British identity in Northern Ireland, in other words, supporters of the DUP, were much more likely to vote leave, and people who prioritise either an Irish identity or people who tend to stand away from both unionism and nationalism were more likely to vote remain. And this makes politics and the kind of political language we use really challenging. So when Boris Johnson lifted some aspects of the COVID lockdown in England recently, and the changes weren't made in Scotland or Wales in the same kind of a way, he didn't say we're lifting these limitations for people who live in England. He talked about how British people could now enjoy new freedoms. And that, I think, is politically very problematic for the maintenance of the rules in Wales and in Scotland, because in some ways we have a Britain-wide media still. So people who identify as British in Wales or in Scotland may have heard Boris Johnson saying British people can behave in this or that way, and they may not always have understood that they were living in a part of the UK where the rules were different. So I think it's really important in these, particularly in these challenging pandemic times, that political leaders use their language very carefully indeed.
Thank you, Daniel. We're coming to the end of our time. There's one last question that I would like to put you very quickly, which has to do with citizens' mobility and the situation of EU citizens in the UK. That was dealt during the first phase of the negotiation. But after that agreement, we start hearing news that maybe the legislation and the agreements that were reached were not being implemented to its full strength. Is there any concern related to EU citizens living in the UK and British citizens living in EU after Brexit?
So there is a process for EU citizens living in the UK to get settled status, and quite a large number of people have applied for and been given that status. There were during the process quite a lot of stories about the difficulties and challenges for some people of acquiring that status and the processes involved. Equally, quite a large number of people who are EU citizens have chosen to leave the UK, perhaps partly because they may have felt that the Brexit referendum result and some of the political atmosphere that followed on from it suggested they weren't welcome, which I guess is the opposite of what that global Britain idea would suggest, at least for EU citizens. And there have been quite a lot of concerns, especially in the context, again, of the COVID pandemic, about, for example, how crops would be picked in farms in the UK. So, you know, for quite a long time, there have been seasonal migrant workers who've come, particularly from Eastern Europe, to pick crops. So there have been some issues around that. I suppose the one thing I would say about it is, as always with legal systems and legal rules, there's the question of the law on the books. So what people, what rights people have in principle, and then there's how effectively those rights can be achieved in practice. And, you know, there is quite a lot of socio-legal research that suggests that the more vulnerable you feel, the less likely you are actively to pursue your rights and pursue their full implementation. So there is some evidence that that at least some categories of workers, of EU citizens in the UK, haven't been fully pursuing or realizing the rights that they've had, at least in principle. You know, that having been said, you know, the same might be true for some
British people living
for some British people. You know, there's been a spike in the city of Leicester, and a local lockdown imposed on Leicester in the context of this pandemic. And it seems to have been associated, or at least it's being reported in the media as being associated with garment factories in that city, which pay less than the minimum wage, and you know, a whole background of investigative journalism over a number of years has drawn attention to the fact that there is a problem in Leicester, which now is very prominent in political debate. So this gap between the rights you have in principle and being able to achieve them is one that, you know, I'm sure it's not just the UK, but it is a significant issue. And the more vulnerable people feel, the less likely they are to pursue their rights. So there may be issues for some EU citizens in the UK that arise in that context.
Okay, thank you so much, Daniel. We come to the end of our time, and I would like to thank you very much for your time and for your expertise and for sharing your views on Brexit and what will follow. I take from this conversation the two solitudes that you mentioned on the relationship between the UK and the European Union, but I also take the four solitudes of the four nations of the UK, of Great Britain, that seem to be talking to each other or talking within each other, but not to each other. And Brexit seems to be a very solitude process, all alone, within and without the European Union. I'd like to thank everybody who follow us on this Lisbon Speed Talk. Thank you for those who posed questions, and once again, thank you, Daniel, for your time and for your knowledge and for sharing with us.
Cruz, you're welcome. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. Muito obrigado a todos e boa tarde.